What fascinates me about adaptations is what irks many others, its need to change. In this day and age where book-to-movie adaptations are made left and right, it's understandable a lot of people dismiss adaptations as quick cash grabs. And it's appealing for companies because there's already a guaranteed audience. But I want to take a less pessimistic approach and take a closer look to what I think is a fascinating example of intertextuality and adaptation, Wicked the Musical. However, you can't discuss the musical without discussing the book by Gregory Maguire, who was dissatisfied by the simplistic world in The Wizard of Oz, both the movie from 1939 and the original children's book by L. Frank Baum. As you can see, there is already a massive string of fiction connected to this one musical, and even if you have never read or seen any of these texts, you'll probably know of the Yellow Brick Road, the Jeweled Shoes and the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman. Chances are you also have heard the sentence,
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
even if just by the sheer amount of references and parodies in other media.
Fly, my pretties, fly, fly!
Before the lights have even dimmed in the theatre, you already have a rich cultural context for the show. And it's these iconic images the musical builds its story around. Even though it's officially an adaptation of the book, it's clear that the writers of the musical didn't expect their audience to have read the novel. This is most notable to how The Wizard of Oz is perceived. In the movie, and to a bigger extent our cultural reference, we know the Wizard of Oz as a great guy. Yes, he's a phony, but it also makes him less dangerous. This belief is held up through most of the first act in the musical. In The Wizard and I, Elphaba is thrilled by the prospect of meeting the wizard. This hope continues when in Something Bad, Elphaba says to Dr. Dillamond that if something bad is happening to the animals, the wizard has to be notified so he can change it.
That's why we have a wizard!
It's only at the end of Act 1, when the wizard uses Elphaba's powers against herself, that she realizes he's not as wonderful as everybody says he is. In the book, this hope in the wizard was never there. When the wizard takes control, baby Elphaba says her very first word: horrors. She repeats it over and over again, predicting the future of Oz and herself. The reader connects the dots much earlier that what's happening to the animals is because of the wizard. So when Elphaba goes to the Emerald City for an audience with the wizard, it's her last resort. Elphaba firmly believes in rationality and research. When she uses Dr. Dillamond's research to try and prove that animals are equal to humans, she hopes logic can persuade the wizard. But it blows up in her face and Elphaba goes underground. What's interesting about the novel is that although the story is about Elphaba, she barely vocalizes. The entire first half of the book is through the eyes of people around her. Only when she goes to the Vinkers we get her point of view, but even that switches as soon as another character is around her. Simply put, we almost never see through Elphaba's eyes. We get to perceive Elphaba through the eyes of others. It makes the reader second guess everything that's stated, which is a fascinating way to describe a protagonist, especially one that's already an antagonist in previous works. But the musical couldn't use Maguire's trick of vocalization because technically it's not a translatable concept to musicals in the first place, but if we stretch its definition a bit towards a more cinematic concept, we can use the definition of point of view, which in the case of musicals I'd argue are the songs. Of course you got dialogue that takes on a big part of the role of exposition, but the songs are a unique vocalization strategy in musicals. These are the moments when we learn most of the characters' emotions and motivations. Something they can no longer express through dialogue. It's closest to an internal book monologue you can get on stage. Contrary to the book, we do have Elphaba's point of view from the beginning, but the citizens of Oz counter it. This is easiest explained through the first and last song, No One Mourns the Wicked. At first we're still in the cultural text of The Wizard of Oz, where we believe that melting the Wicked Witch was a good deed. But by the end of the musical, No One Mourns the Wicked stings for the audience. Someone does mourn the Wicked Witch of the West. For one, Glinda does, because she believes for the rest of her life that Elphaba did indeed die. But there are a lot of ways to express vocalization. Take the lighting in the show. I believe the lighting comes closest to the concept of an external vocalizer, or to use a somewhat simpler term, an all-knowing narrator. The lighting dictates what we are and are not supposed to see. For instance, with transitions, we're not supposed to watch Nessa Rose anymore. The lighting guides us to a new part of the scene that's rapidly built up. Of course you can watch Nessa Rose if you want to, but then you're actively ignoring what the lighting, the storyteller, is trying to show you. However, it is more than just guiding our attention. One of my favorite parts is during No Good Deed. Suddenly, Elphaba's lighting turns into a color we have never seen before. Her green skin, the one recognizable feature that has pestered her entire life and something that the audience has grown to love during the musical, turns unrecognizably pale. It's here when she sings and accepts her role as antagonist. the role she had in the original story, but the role that does not line up with the Elphaba we have seen during Wicked. This lining shows the terrifying Wicked Witch of the West that the citizens of Oz have been seeing the entire time. But as soon as she sings the next line, she steps outside that light. And we're back to Elphaba's point of view. Alright, so we tried to compare different vocal strategies as far as you can apply these to musicals. Let's now dive into some of the other things the musical has to translate. For example, how does the audience feel that they are in such an odd place like Oz? The novel uses a lot of descriptions for this, but that's not something a musical can use. Instead of looking at the characters or plot, we now must look at everything else that's on stage. The sets and props give us a global idea of what Oz might look like, but it's the costumes that really show the difference between our world and Oz. I would argue that you can put dance moves on that list as well, but what has surprised me the most is the language that is used. You may have noticed that Wicked uses a lot of play on words.
Innuendo. Out your window.
And characters muttering words like disturbance and disrespectation. But taking a closer look, there's most definitely a pattern there. For instance, Elphaba never says these kinds of words, making her in that aspect more relatable. While characters like Glinda and Madame Morrible use this kind of speech the most. So why the blending of these words? Of course you can say it's just for some quick and funny jokes, but then why not let Elphaba speak similarly? In many ways, this speech pattern is most commonly found in the Ozians that support the wizard. It represents the higher society that benefits from the animal plans or just doesn't care about the cause. This is why Glinda uses these plans. In the first act to reflect Galinda's ignorance, and in the second act to reflect that she sided with the wizard. Her loyalty wavers of course, but only after she realizes Madame Morrible was behind the death of Nessarose, she stops using this speech pattern altogether, reflecting that her loyalty lies with Elphaba. These blends are interesting to me because it's not used in the book or even in The Wizard of Oz. This language is unique to the musical. These details show that change isn't always bad. Instead, understanding the differences in media and how adaptations translate themes of their predecessors may enrich your experience of both texts. After all, adaptations have to change. Otherwise, you might as well show the original through a copy machine. There's no denying that the book and musical are very different. Maguire's Wicked is darker and in some ways very unsatisfying, but that's exactly the story he wanted to tell. You're supposed to feel unsatisfied because we follow the story of an antagonist. Meanwhile, the musical has a limited amount of time to build up a story and therefore takes a clearer path and tries to tie up some loose ends the book only ever speculates in. Neither version is bad. They're just trying to accomplish different things. Even in an era where it almost seems like the only new things that are created are bad remakes that are an insult to the original, it's important not to forget that stories aren't created in a vacuum. Old stories inspire new ones. Creators build on a foundation that was laid before they were even born. Hell, even L. Frank Baum created The Wonderful Wizard of Oz because he believed that classical fairy tales were outdated. He argued children's books were only needed for entertainment because moral guidance was included in education. More than anything, I describe Wicked as a hunger. A hunger to not only read and enjoy, but engage with the stories we consume. Both adjusting and criticizing it in a way that today's audience can relate to. Adapting it into a framework that suits our current culture and society. Even if you don't agree. Especially if you don't agree. That's how new stories are created. Wicked is an example that shows adaptations work best to those who are brave enough to engage with change and reimagine. Baby Elphaba says her very first word. Horrors. Oh fuck. Horrors.